Look at a map of Singapore in 1960. It's small, compact, almost fragile, like a dot clinging to the southern edge of the Malay Peninsula. Now look at Singapore today. The coastline has changed. The island has grown outward, aggressively, confidently. Singapore is now about 25% larger than it used to be. That extra land didn't slowly rise from the ocean. It didn't appear through some natural geological process. It was built, and much of it was taken. Singapore is the world's largest importer of sand. Not oil, not steel, sand. And not the kind you casually walk on at the beach, but marine sand, dragged from riverbeds, coastlines, and seabeds across Southeast Asia. Over the past few decades, Singapore has consumed more than 500 million tons of it. Enough to cover Manhattan. Enough to erase islands. Enough to quietly redraw borders without a single tank crossing a frontier. This is the dark geography behind one of the world's most admired cities. Modern Singapore is sold as a miracle. Marina Bay sands rising like a sci-fi fortress. Gardens by the bay glowing with artificial trees. A city of glass, order, and efficiency. It feels almost unreal. Too clean, too perfect, too controlled. But beneath that image lies something far messier. Because the city didn't just grow upward, it grew outward into the sea. And every meter of that expansion came from somewhere else. Singapore's hunger for land is rooted in fear. The country is tiny. It has no natural resources, no agricultural hinterland, no room for strategic depth. From the moment it became independent, survival meant planning ahead. Growth wasn't optional, it was existential. More land meant more ports, more industry, more housing, more runways, more resilience. Land reclamation became a national strategy. The idea was simple. Dump sand into the ocean, compact it, and build on top. Singapore mastered the technique. Entire districts were created this way. Changi Airport sits on reclaimed land. Jurong Island, Singapore's petrochemical heart, was stitched together from 7 smaller islands using sand. Marina Bay itself is artificial. The city didn't just expand, it engineered itself. But there was a problem. Singapore doesn't have sand, so it went shopping. In the early years, sand came from nearby. Malaysia was the first major supplier. Barges crossed the Johor Strait daily. Dredging operations expanded. At first, the impacts were subtle. A collapsed riverbank here, a shrinking beach there. But by the mid-1990s, Malaysia began seeing the cost. Coastal erosion accelerated. Fishing communities complained. Entire stretches of shoreline were destabilized. In 1997, Malaysia slammed the brakes. Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad accused sand miners of digging up Malaysia and giving it to other people. The government banned sand exports to Singapore. Singapore didn't stop reclaiming land. Instead, it looked south. Indonesia was next. The Riau Islands, scattered just kilometers from Singapore, became prime targets. Hundreds of small islands, low-lying, sandy, barely above sea level, dot the region. They're fragile by nature, held together by sediment flows and coral systems. Once dredging began offshore, the effects were immediate. Currents changed, shorelines retreated. Villagers watched their beaches disappear. Then the islands themselves began to shrink. By the early 2000s, Indonesian officials were alarmed. Some islands had lost significant landmass, others were partially submerged. In 2007, Indonesia announced that at least 24 small islands had either vanished or slipped beneath the sea entirely. These weren't just landforms, they were markers of sovereignty. When an island disappears, borders shift, maritime claims weaken, territory dissolves. Indonesia banned sand exports to Singapore. Still, the sand kept coming. Vietnam tried next. In 2009, after rivers collapsed and deltas eroded, Vietnam banned sand exports. Cambodia imposed restrictions. Malaysia reinstated a total ban on sea sand exports in 2019. On paper, Southeast Asia had shut the tap. In reality, it hadn't. Between 2008 and 2016, something strange showed up in the data. Singapore reported importing millions of tons of sand from countries that officially claimed they exported zero sand to Singapore. Zero licenses, zero shipments, zero records. And yet, Singapore's imports continued uninterrupted. The only explanation was illegal trade. This is where the sand war went underground. Across the region, sand mafias emerged. Dredging operations ran at night. Barges turned off tracking systems. Paperwork was falsified. Sand was moved through intermediaries, relabeled, laundered through ports with weak oversight. Corrupt officials looked the other way. By the time the sand reached Singapore, it was clean, legally invisible. The scale was enormous, hundreds of millions of tons, rivers hollowed out, seabeds stripped bare, entire ecosystems destabilized, and the damage wasn't abstract. Sand mining destroys more than just land. It collapses riverbanks. It kills mangroves that protect coastlines from storms. It smothers coral reefs that act as natural breakwaters. Fish nurseries disappear. Salt water intrudes into farmland. Communities that relied on the sea for generations suddenly face erosion, flooding, and loss of livelihood. Meanwhile, Singapore rose higher. There's a brutal irony at the center of this story. Singapore is reclaiming land to protect itself from climate change. Rising seas threaten the city. Flooding is an existential risk. Reclamation, seawalls, and elevated infrastructure are framed as survival measures. But the dredging that feeds this expansion destroys the very natural barriers, reefs, mangroves, sediment systems that protect neighboring countries from those same rising seas. Singapore fortifies itself while making others more vulnerable. Ask Singaporean officials about this, and you'll hear a familiar defense. Singapore buys sand legally. Exporting countries are responsible for enforcing their own laws. If sand arrives, it's because someone sold it. Technically, that's true. Morally, it's more complicated. When one nation's survival depends on another's erosion, responsibility doesn't vanish with paperwork. Demand creates supply, and Singapore's demand is relentless. By the late 2000s, however, even Singapore began to feel the pressure. Sand was getting harder to source, bans were tightening, scrutiny was increasing. The old model, dumping endless sand into the sea, was becoming politically risky and environmentally unsustainable. So Singapore pivoted. Instead of filling the sea, it decided to push the sea away. Borrowing from Dutch engineering, Singapore embraced polders, low-lying land enclosed by dikes and protected by pumping systems. The most ambitious project is Pulau Tekong. Massive seawalls encircle reclaimed land. Water levels are mechanically controlled. The system uses about 40% less sand than traditional reclamation. On the surface, it looks like progress. Less sand, more efficiency. Climate resilience. But polders come with their own risks. Pumps must run forever. Dikes must never fail. Mechanical systems don't forgive neglect. In a world of rising seas and intensifying storms, failure isn't hypothetical. It's inevitable at some point. And even polders need sand, just less of it. Singapore's story isn't one of cartoon villainy, it's a story of a desperate survivor. A city-state trapped by geography, choosing expansion because retreat isn't an option. Every decision is framed through the lens of survival. But survival has consequences, and those consequences have been pushed outward, onto poorer neighbors, weaker ecosystems, and invisible coastlines. Maps don't show this violence, they just show growth. A bigger island, a longer runway, a new skyline, but somewhere else a shoreline collapses, a fishing village floods, an island vanishes, no invasion, no war, just sand. And that's what makes this story unsettling. Because as climate change accelerates, sand is becoming one of the most valuable resources on Earth. Sea walls, artificial islands, elevated cities, coastal defenses. The demand is exploding. What Singapore pioneered quietly may become a global blueprint. If that happens, this won't be an isolated story. It will be the future of geopolitics, where land is taken not with soldiers, but with dredgers, where borders shift grain by grain, where destruction happens far from the skyline that benefits from it. There is also a psychological element to Singapore's land expansion that rarely gets discussed. Fear. Not panic, not hysteria, but a constant, calculated fear of limitation. From its earliest days as an independent nation, Singapore's leaders internalized one idea above all else. If you stop growing, you die. Growth wasn't optional, it was survival doctrine. That mindset explains why land is treated not as geography, but as strategy. Every hectare reclaimed represents insurance against population pressure, against foreign dependence, against geopolitical vulnerability. In that worldview, sand is not stolen, it is secured. The moral framing shifts depending on which side of the shoreline you stand on. This is why criticism rarely penetrates policy circles. To acknowledge wrongdoing would be to admit fragility, and fragility is the one thing Singapore's image cannot afford. Yet the consequences of this mindset are increasingly difficult to contain. In Indonesia, coastal villages affected by dredging report saltwater intrusion contaminating farmland. Crops fail, drinking water turns brackish, fishermen travel farther each year for diminishing returns. These are not abstract environmental indicators. They are direct economic shocks to communities already living on the edge. What makes this especially insidious is the lack of a single villain. There is no invading army, no visible aggressor. The damage comes from barges operating offshore, often at night, often under flags of convenience. When authorities arrive, they find empty waters and plausible deniability. This fragmentation of responsibility is exactly why accountability never materializes. Singapore points to suppliers. Suppliers point to smugglers. Smugglers disappear into informal networks. By the time the damage is visible, the transaction is long complete and irreversible. Even international law struggles to keep up. Maritime boundaries are defined by coastlines. But what happens when those coastlines physically change? When an island shrinks, does its territorial claim shrink with it? When land is artificially created, does sovereignty automatically extend? These are not theoretical questions, they are legal grey zones that will define future disputes. Because somewhere, beneath the polished skyline and manicured waterfronts, lies land that remembers where it came from, even if the world chooses to forget. The question isn't whether land can be stolen without violence, it's how often it already is, and how much of it the world is willing to lose so that a few cities can stay above water. And the next time you look at Singapore's glittering skyline, remember this: every square meter of reclaimed land has a history, not of triumph, but of extraction.